Welcome to Middle East Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: Israel hints that it has retaliatorily struck international targets. Live updates: Palestinian refugee camps shelled in central Gaza as Israel seeks to expand offensive. Netanyahu says no peace until Hamas destroyed, amid more Israeli strikes on Gaza. Israeli forces bombard central Gaza in apparent move toward expanding ground offensive. What happened to IS in 2023? Israel hints that it has retaliatorily struck international targets. ABC. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has suggested that the country has retaliated against attacks from Iraq, Yemen, and Iran. The conflict with Hamas-led militants in Gaza has escalated to include other areas of the region. Israeli military officials have said that they have responded to attacks from Lebanon and Syria and have conducted raids on Palestinian militants in the West Bank. Israel has not publicly disclosed any actions in Yemen, where the Iran-aligned Houthi group has launched missile and drone attacks on Israel, nor in Iraq, where a pro-Iran militia claimed to have fired a drone at Israel. Israel has also not published details of operations in Iran, which is a key sponsor of Hamas and Hezbollah. Meanwhile, Israeli forces have continued their bombardment of Gaza, with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stating that there would be no let-up in the attacks on Hamas. The Israeli military has said that 160 soldiers have been killed since ground operations began on October 20. Live updates: Palestinian refugee camps shelled in central Gaza as Israel seeks to expand offensive. Associated Press. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has stated that Israel is facing a multi-arena war from 7 different fronts. He listed the fronts as Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, West Bank, Iraq, Yemen, and Iran. Gallant did not provide further details on which fronts Israel has already acted on. He also emphasized the importance of achieving the goals of the war in order to protect the people living in Israel. Additionally, during the same meeting, Committee Chair Yuli Edelstein mentioned that Israel is transitioning from the second to the third stage of the military operation in Gaza, indicating that the conflict may continue for a long time. Netanyahu says no peace until Hamas destroyed, amid more Israeli strikes on Gaza. South China Morning Post. Israeli forces have continued to shell central Gaza as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed no respite in the fight against Hamas. The conflict has now cost over 20,900 Palestinian lives, and both the UN and the US have called for a ceasefire. Meanwhile, Israeli forces claim to have killed over 10 fighters in separate incidents in Khan Yunis, and the Air Force has carried out a strike against 100 Hamas targets, including tunnel shafts. The Israeli military has said that 160 soldiers have been killed in Gaza since ground operations began on October 20. Netanyahu vowed to stay the course in an op-ed published in the Wall Street Journal, saying that Hamas must be destroyed, Gaza demilitarized and Palestinian society de-radicalized before peace can be achieved. At least 20,900 Gazans have been killed during the conflict, including 240 in the last 24 hours. In addition, U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria have come under attack from Iran-backed militants, with the U.S. military carrying out retaliatory airstrikes. Israeli forces bombard central Gaza in apparent move toward expanding ground offensive. Associated Press. Israeli forces have bombarded Palestinian refugee camps in central Gaza, indicating a potential expansion of their ground offensive into a third section of the territory. This indicates that there is a long and destructive road ahead as Israel seeks to crush Hamas. Israeli forces have been engaged in heavy urban fighting in northern Gaza and in the southern city of Khan Yunis, driving Palestinians into smaller corners of territory in search of refuge. Despite international pressure for a ceasefire and U.S. calls to reduce civilian casualties, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has warned that the fight isn't close to finished. So far, the Israeli offensive has been one of the most devastating military campaigns in recent history, with over 20,600 Palestinians killed, 2/3 of whom were women and children, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. In response to the Israeli-Hamas war, an Israeli airstrike in Syria killed an Iranian general, prompting vows of revenge from Iran, and U.S. warplanes hit Iranian-backed militias in Iraq who had carried out a drone strike that injured American soldiers. What happened to IS in 2023? BBC. The number of attacks claimed by the Islamic State, IS, jihadist group dropped significantly in 2023, according to data collected by BBC Monitoring. The group claimed a total of 838 attacks globally this year, compared to 1,811 for the same period last year, marking a 53% drop. The decrease in attacks is attributed to the loss of IS's last stronghold in Syria in 2019 and a focus on building up its African branches. However, IS is still conducting insurgent operations in Iraq and Syria and overseeing networks in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The United Nations completely failed in Lebanon. Foreign policy. The recent attack on southern Israel by Hamas has put pressure on the Israeli government to destroy Hezbollah and its arsenal. Since the start of the war against Hamas, around 80,000 Israelis from northern Israel have left their homes due to missile attacks by Hezbollah. Israelis fear that Hezbollah could carry out a similar attack to the one made by Hamas, but on a much larger scale. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has warned of war and said that Israel would act with all the means at its disposal unless the international community compels Hezbollah to withdraw. The Israeli government also claims that UN Resolution 1701, which has been in force since 2006, was supposed to ensure the removal of Hezbollah from southern Lebanon. At the end of the 34-day conflict in 2006, the UN updated UNIFIL's mandate under Resolution 1701 and tasked it with establishing an area free of any armed personnel, assets, and weapons other than those of the government of Lebanon and of UNIFIL, between the Blue Line and the Litani River. However, Hezbollah has fortified southern Lebanon since 2006 and has built unauthorized firing ranges and stocked rockets in civilian infrastructure. The Lebanese Armed Forces, LAF, have also denied UNIFIL access to patrol certain areas. UNIFIL is sent under the authority of Chapter 6 of the United Nations Charter, which limits its mandate. The mandate does not allow the peacekeepers to enforce the resolution with military action. The LAF has not asked UNIFIL for assistance in locating and removing Hezbollah weapons caches, despite the presence of thousands of peacekeepers. Israelis suspect that the peacekeepers lack the will to challenge Hezbollah and are deterred by attacks. The Israeli government is now trying to achieve the goal of ending Hezbollah's presence and destroying its infrastructure on the border through diplomatic channels. Could Israel's Gaza war drag Iraq into another conflict? Al Jazeera. The US has launched attacks on Iran-aligned groups in Iraq, while a senior Iranian general was assassinated in Syria. The US military said it launched strikes on 3 sites used by Iran-aligned group Kataib Hezbollah and other unnamed affiliated groups in Iraq. This comes after Kataib Hezbollah claimed responsibility for a major attack on a US base in Erbil, northern Iraq. The strikes by the Iraqi groups followed the assassination of Iran's top commander in Syria, Brigadier General Razi Mousavi, by missiles believed to have been launched by Israel. The US and Iran are not eager for a full-scale war, according to Middle East researcher Ali Akbar Deraini. In Turkey, Erdogan's charges of Western hypocrisy stick. Economist. Turkey's president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has used the conflict in Gaza over the past 3 months to highlight his own moral high ground, weakly implying that countries such as the US are hypocritical in their foreign policies. Erdogan is suggesting that if Western countries criticize Turkey for using excessive force in northern Syria, they should also criticize Israel for its actions in Gaza. This has compounded the tension between Turkey and the US and Europe, with the relationship between Turkey and Israel also being damaged. This has wider implications for Turkey's relations with NATO and their aspirations to join the EU. However, the conflict in Gaza has also affected perceptions of Western countries in Turkey. Many Turks see Western values and norms as disintegrating when it comes to the conflict in Gaza, leading to a decline in support for both the US and Europe. Furthermore, Turkey's president is using the conflict in Gaza to strengthen his position and his arguments against outside criticism, thus becoming increasingly less accountable for his own abuses of power. The US strikes Iran-backed militias in Iraq after troops wounded in drone attack. Washington Post. US forces have carried out attacks against Iran-backed militia groups in Iraq, in response to a drone attack on Erbil Air Base that injured 3 service members. The US strikes targeted 3 locations used by Kataib Hezbollah and affiliated groups for drone activities. The strikes come as Iranian-backed militia groups have increased attacks on US and coalition troops in Iraq and Syria, owing to anger in the Middle East over US support of Israel's military campaign in Gaza. The US has previously taken similar action against Iran-backed groups in Syria. The best conversations of the year. Foreign policy. FP Live hosts weekly discussions on pressing topics in world affairs. Some notable guests this year have included Ehud Barak, former Israeli Prime Minister, who discussed Israel's wartime decisions and their global reception, Taiwanese Foreign Minister Joseph Wu, who talked about Taiwan's efforts to deter a Chinese invasion, Catherine Tai, U.S. Trade Representative, who discussed the U.S.'s trade policy in relationship with China, Colin Kahl, former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, who discussed the U.S.-China relationship and aid to Ukraine, and Samantha Power, USAID Administrator, who discussed USAID's priorities and the Biden administration's foreign policy. Ladies and gentlemen, 6 Doctors here, your resident observer from the 6 Degrees world, bringing you the latest news from around the globe. It seems like tensions in the Middle East continue to escalate, with Israel hinting at retaliatory strikes against targets in Iraq, Yemen, and Iran. The conflict with Hamas in Gaza has expanded to include other areas in the region, and Israeli forces have continued their bombardment of Gaza. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has stated that there will be no let-up in the attacks on Hamas until they are destroyed. Meanwhile, the Islamic State, IS, has seen a significant drop in the number of attacks claimed, with a 53% decrease compared to last year. However, IS still remains active in Iraq, Syria, and other regions. In Lebanon, the United Nations has come under criticism for failing to remove Hezbollah from southern Lebanon, despite a UN resolution calling for their disarmament. Israel is now seeking to achieve this goal through diplomatic channels. The conflict in Gaza has also had wider implications, with Turkey's President Erdogan using it to highlight Western hypocrisy and damage relations with the US and Europe. This has led to a decline in support for Western countries in Turkey. On another note, the US has carried out strikes against Iran-backed militias in Iraq in response to a drone attack on a US base. These strikes come amid increased attacks on US and coalition troops in Iraq and Syria. Lastly, I want to mention the great discussions we've had this year on FP Live. We've had the opportunity to hear from notable guests such as former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, Taiwanese Foreign Minister Joseph Wu, US Trade Representative Catherine Tai, and many more. So, there you have it, the latest news from around the world. The situation in the Middle East remains volatile, and tensions continue to rise. It's important for all parties involved to find a peaceful resolution to these conflicts. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about the escalating tensions in the Middle East? Let's discuss. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.